In this video, we're going to define our first Smithy spec. We will not get to generating code yet, but we will just talk about the Smithy language, how it's used, and how you should model your services in it. So I'm going to start with a blank workspace. I just have a getignore here, and I'm going to create a new Smithy file. I'm going to call it weather.smithy, and it's just going to be a file on the top level of my editor. You will notice that there's some IDE support that I have for the language. I'm using this extension for Smithy, made and published by Disney Streaming. There is an in-progress extension from AWS, but I think right now the better one to use is actually the Disney one. So that's what I'm using, and I recommend that you use it as well. Now, we have a file, and it's saying we should define a version. That is true, we should. And there's an action here, but I'm just going to do this by hand. So you use this kind of funky syntax. It's probably the only thing I ever use the syntax for. It's just like you define a version for the file. And you have to do this for every file, every Smithy file. It's not much of an issue. It's just more of a, you just get used to this. And most of the time you want to put things into a namespace. If you're going to define services or any kind of shapes, you actually need a namespace. So I'm going to define one, and I'm going to just say, my namespace is hello. So namespace hello. So we have a namespace. Now we need to put some shapes in it. And at this point, you should ask yourself the question what you're trying to write, what you're trying to create. And I want to define an HTTP service that will have two endpoints, one for getting the weather in my current city, and one for registering like a city in the same service. So I'm going to have something like a weather service, and I'm actually going to create one here. And a service doesn't need to have anything, but you most likely want to refer to one or more operations. So I'm going to define operations as well. And my first one is going to be get weather. And the other one that I'm going to have is going to be called, let's just say, create city. Okay, this is already a valid Smithy model. I didn't need to add any kind of HTTP specific information or anything like that. It just works. So we will have two operations that are not attached to any service, and they don't have any input or output. It's time to connect them to the service. So we can say operations, and now we have to list all the operations in this service that will be used here. You wouldn't be able to run any of this because there is no protocol specific information. So Smithy in itself, the language, is very protocol agnostic. And we started by defining just the shapes that we are going to be dealing with, and none of the details of the protocol, the transport, serialization, or anything like that. So at this point, I still don't have to do it. Let's just focus on the operations. So get weather is going to have an input. This is not a name I made up. This is like a standard name of every operation in Smithy that has input. You need input, and there are two ways that you can attach an input to an operation. I'll start with the older one, which is not that commonly seen anymore, but just to be complete, you create a structure called, there's a convention, you don't have to follow it, but it's better to do it. Get weather input, so name of the operation and input. And now let's say we want to have a required parameter called city. And now I have to make this the input of the operation. So we are saying that the input field of this operation is that targets that type. Now the new version of this, the new idea, which you can only use if you are using version 2 of the language, is you can create a sort of anonymous input type by using the colon and equals separator. And now, actually, this is it. Now this is the same as it was before. Now I don't need to define this struct here. It's sort of like an inline definition of this shape. So now that I've defined the input, it's time to define the output. And we're going to do something very similar. I think I'll just say there's a required weather, and it's going to be a string. But just to show you why sometimes there's required and sometimes not, we can also have like degrees, which is going to be an integer. These types, string and integer, are built in. They come from the Smithy API namespace, which is the default namespace that you always sort of have access to. And there's a bunch of other stuff in here. We're not going to look at all of that, maybe in another video. But yeah, here we have an output, which is a structure. An operation input and output are always structures. It's just whether you actually have a name for them or not. It will have a name, like when you compile this to something, like when you generate the code or whatever, there will be like a get weather output here. It's just going to be named automatically according to the operation. So our output has one required field and one that is not required. Now let's do the other operation. Oh, actually, so because get weather is a read-only operation, I can also tag it with that. This is going to become more important later on. But for now, I'm just telling Smithy that this operation might be used for things that are read-only, maybe something that uses retries. We'll look at this and decide that a retry is safe because this doesn't perform any mutations. So now that we have this, let's get back to the other operation. In create city, I'm going to have an input with two required fields. So we're going to take a city and a country just to have like some information about the city that we are creating. And in the output, we will just have a city ID. It's going to be a string. We can also do something like this. We can define a string city ID. And now this becomes sort of like a new type or like an opaque type from Scala or other languages that you may know. So we can actually use this in place of that, that string, and that's going to work. In fact, the uppercase string is a special case of this in the standard library of Smithy, but otherwise it's sort of the same thing. It's just like a different kind of string. For example, when we generate the code with Smithy4s, this will actually have a new type. So that's what it is for. And I think the input here in the get weather should also be a city ID. So I'm going to change that as well. Okay, so now we have built our service, our operations, but we still don't have any protocol information. So this is time to start doing it. And sadly, in the standard Smithy library, there are no protocols at all. So I need to pull in some sort of other library that actually has some protocol definitions. And one of these is Alloy. Alloy is a library built by Disney Streaming, again, the guys who made the extension here. It contains a very simple JSON-based, REST-based protocol, which I would like to use here. So I need to first tell my IDE about it so that I have like completions and go to definition and so on, and also errors if I mess up, because it may not be clear, but if you use something that doesn't exist, you do get an error. This is really awesome about Smithy. You get immediate feedback that you messed up and you need to correct some issue. So back to Alloy, I'm going to define a smithy-build file. This is used for other tools as well, not so much on the Scala side. On the Scala side, we don't really rely on this tool, on this file very much, but the Smithy language server, which backs the editor plugin, needs this file to get information about what dependencies you are going to pull in. And I'm going to define a Maven dependency. And I'm going to just copy paste this from the browser. I want to use the latest version of Alloy. We see some windows here. The project was loaded with external jars. So it seems like it was successful. Let's try to use the protocol. The protocol is called simple REST JSON. So there it is. And immediately I got errors because my operations are not specified to be HTTP operations. This protocol, or the validators for this protocol, decide that they are not, we cannot use them. If I don't use these services, it's fine. But if I were to use them, I need to conform to the requirements that this protocol involves on my operations. So get weather has to be an HTTP operation. It needs the HTTP trait. Traits are these things with these annotations. This is like an applied read-only trait, and you define them. Actually, you define them in the language. So it's a sort of language feature that allows you to define these sort of extensions to the language. We will talk about this more in the future. So I need to define, I need to add this HTTP trait to my operation, and let's do that. So Yeah, we have some completions here. Method and the URI are required, so I'm going to say method is get, and the URI is going to be something like city ID weather. And actually, this still doesn't know that city ID is going to be this city ID. I mean, if we go look at the errors, it will tell you that there's like a URI label found in the HTTP trait that doesn't have a corresponding member marked with the HTTP label trait. So I can mark it, and now Smithy is able to tell that this field is going to come from this label. If I use a different name here, it's going to again be an error. So that's very cool. I really like this feature. And now we need to also add HTTP bindings, so the HTTP trait to the create city operation. I think the cities will be fine, and let's prefix this one with cities as well. So at this point, we could try to validate our model or generate some code. I know that it's valid because, well, you don't have to trust the editor, but I do know that this is valid syntax, and we have everything we need to generate some code and run our service. But we will do that in the next video.